Have you ever felt a strange tension inside you, an invisible pressure, as if something within were preparing to reveal itself, but you can't yet name it? It's not chaos, not calm, something in between. You sense a shift coming, though everything around you looks the same. That quiet unease is your consciousness, whispering before it speaks. It's trying to show you what you've been unwilling to face, the hidden truth beneath your ordinary days. This is the moment just before revelation, the pause between who you've been and who you're about to become. There's a peculiar moment when life seems to tilt, not violently, but subtly, like the floor beneath you is shifting by a few degrees, enough to make you lose balance without understanding why. That sensation of unease, that quiet restlessness that doesn't respond to reason, isn't random. It's consciousness stirring beneath the surface, testing the strength of the shell you've built to protect yourself from change. Discomfort often enters quietly, disguised as fatigue, irritation, or a vague feeling that something is off. You tell yourself it's stress, lack of sleep, or the weight of ordinary life. But what if that tension isn't trying to harm you? What if it's the first tremor of your own evolution? Each time reality starts to tremble, your inner system might be attempting to reconfigure itself, to push you out of a reality that has expired. The mind interprets this tremor as danger because it loves patterns. It depends on stability, on predictable loops that make it feel safe. When those loops begin to dissolve, the mind sounds the alarm. You call it anxiety. Yet from a quantum perspective, what's actually happening might be a collapse of probabilities, your consciousness releasing an outdated version of itself to make space for coherence with something new. The chaos you feel isn't the end of order, but the process of recalibration. Imagine your consciousness as a tuning fork. Every belief, relationship, and routine vibrates at a certain frequency. Over time, you start resonating with frequencies that no longer match who you've become. The dissonance creates discomfort, not as punishment, but as feedback. The vibration grows louder until you either realign or force yourself into numbness. In that sense, discomfort isn't a symptom to suppress, it's data to decode. You can sense this when an old goal suddenly feels hollow, when a conversation that once energized you now drains you, or when a truth you've avoided starts surfacing in small fragments, through dreams, slips of the tongue, or chance encounters. The body notices first. It tenses, resists, or grows restless, long before the conscious mind understands what's happening. If you pause inside that tension instead of escaping it, something begins to reveal itself. The pressure that felt unbearable starts to show its geometry. It isn't chaos but compression, the way carbon turns into diamond. You begin to see that the discomfort isn't pushing against you, but for you, urging you to shed the fragments that can't follow you into the next version of your life. Yet this is where most people retreat. They rush to fill the silence with activity, distractions, or premature conclusions. But the warning inside discomfort isn't meant to be silenced. It's meant to be heard. It asks for your attention, not your analysis. To listen, you have to stay still long enough for the static to clear, for the pattern beneath the noise to emerge. Here's a simple practice. When unease appears, don't ask, "What's wrong with me?" Ask, "What is this feeling trying to show me that I'm refusing to see?" Then watch, not for answers in words, but for shifts in energy, posture, or intuition. The information arrives symbolically, the way nature communicates through timing, coincidence, and sensation, rather than logic. This is how consciousness guides transformation. It speaks through the subtle language of discomfort. The more you resist, the more it amplifies the signal until resistance becomes impossible. The cycle repeats until awareness replaces avoidance. Each repetition is not punishment, but calibration, a way for consciousness to bring you closer to alignment with what you truly are. There's a paradox hidden here. The stronger your desire for control, the more discomfort grows. The rational mind wants to map, label, and fix. But consciousness doesn't operate on linear equations. It's non-local, fluid, and paradoxical. When you stop trying to fix discomfort and instead start to feel it, you begin to synchronize with the intelligence that created it. Think of a musician tuning an instrument. The discord you hear before harmony isn't a mistake. It's a necessary stage in the process. Your inner life functions the same way. When you learn to stay with the sound, to hear its pattern instead of fleeing from it, the note eventually resolves. The noise that once felt unbearable becomes part of a greater rhythm. Discomfort, then, is not a failure of peace, it's its messenger. It warns you that something inside is misaligned with truth. Not moral truth, but structural truth, the architecture of your consciousness demanding renovation. You may lose a plan, a title, or a certainty, but what you gain is coherence, a subtler form of order that feels quieter, but infinitely more alive. And this is precisely where the next movement begins, the one few recognize in time, the subtle danger of turning away from that warning, of drowning it beneath routine and distraction. Because when consciousness whispers and you ignore it, the whisper doesn't vanish. It grows louder until it becomes impossible not to hear. It rarely begins with a crisis. It begins with small, almost invisible signals, moments so delicate that they slip past your attention, a quiet heaviness in the chest before a conversation, the faint resistance you feel before agreeing to something you don't truly want, a sudden exhaustion after spending time in a place or with a person that no longer fits the rhythm of your life. These moments are the first language of consciousness. And when you ignore them, they don't disappear. They migrate deeper where they ferment in silence. We like to believe that what we ignore loses power, but the truth is the opposite. Every signal dismissed becomes energy deferred. Each unacknowledged emotion stores itself somewhere in the system, body, memory, even circumstance, waiting for a time when you'll finally be still enough to feel it. The longer it waits, the louder it becomes. What begins as a whisper of intuition eventually turns into a chain of external events designed to get your attention. Life keeps escalating the volume until you finally listen. Ignoring subtle signs is not mere distraction, it's a trained survival instinct. From early on, you were taught to favor clarity over confusion, logic over sensation, productivity over pause. So when your inner signals contradict your outer identity, you suppress them. You smile when something inside you tightens. You rationalize the ache as just stress, but those micro-denials accumulate. Over time, they form a parallel life, one where your body remembers what your mind refuses to admit. This is where many forms of suffering originate. The anxiety that seems to arrive without cause, the fatigue that rest can't fix, the inexplicable sense of distance even in moments of apparent success. They are not random. They're echoes of ignored communications. Your consciousness doesn't punish, it insists. It will reshape circumstances until you're forced to face what you've avoided. You can see this pattern in the smallest details. You postpone a decision because it feels uncomfortable. You stay in a job that quietly drains your vitality because it's familiar. You keep repeating a conversation with someone you've outgrown because you're afraid of what silence might reveal. Each time you override the sign, you reinforce an illusion. That control is safer than awareness. But the more you try to control, the more the signs accumulate beneath the surface, like pressure beneath tectonic plates. Eventually, they will move. There's a cost to this resistance. The body begins to translate what the psyche denies. Muscles tighten around old emotions. Sleep becomes restless. The immune system, that ancient translator of truth, starts to send messages through fatigue, tension, or illness. None of these are punishments. They're feedback loops. The universe, through the intelligence of your own biology, keeps trying to bring you back into coherence. It helps to think of these signs not as obstacles, but as correspondences, each one a thread connecting you to a deeper intelligence. A pattern of synchronicities, subtle moods, coincidences that repeat with increasing precision. Yet because they don't arrive through reason, you tend to dismiss them. The modern mind trusts only what it can measure. But consciousness speaks through context, not proof. It organizes meaning through pattern, timing, and resonance. Imagine an old instrument left unplayed for years. Its strings loosen, its tone dulls. The signs you ignore are like the slight discord you hear when you finally pluck the string again. That sound is not failure, it's feedback. It tells you where to adjust, how to bring the instrument back into tune. Ignoring it doesn't stop the dissonance. It only ensures that the next time you play, the sound will be harsher. There's also a subtler danger. When you silence inner signs long enough, you begin to lose trust in your own perception. You start outsourcing truth to others, to experts, partners, systems, forgetting that intuition is the most advanced form of perception your consciousness possesses. The more you silence it, the more disconnected you become from your own internal navigation system. You drift, chasing external markers of success that no longer carry meaning. But life has a way of restoring alignment. When you refuse to listen inwardly, it speaks through external events. A job ends abruptly. A relationship dissolves. Plans collapse in synchrony. It's not chaos, it's correction. Each disruption is a physical manifestation of what your inner world has been trying to tell you quietly. The universe mirrors your inner resistance until recognition becomes unavoidable. The real risk, then, is not the discomfort of facing what the signs reveal, but the numbness that replaces awareness when you don't. Numbness feels like safety at first. It keeps you functioning, but it also keeps you asleep. It dulls the precision of perception, the sensitivity required to notice when your path begins to shift. You can't evolve toward what you can't feel. So the invitation is simple. Start paying attention to what you usually dismiss. The faint hesitation before saying yes. The fatigue that doesn't respond to rest. The pattern that repeats until it demands reflection. Treat each as a messenger, not a malfunction. Observation itself begins the transformation, because the moment you stop ignoring the signs, their energy changes form, from friction to guidance, from disturbance to alignment. And as you start noticing, you'll realize that these subtle signals were never separate from the process of awakening. They were the first movement of it. Which leads naturally to what happens next. When the rational mind tries to interfere, trying to make sense of what consciousness communicates in symbols and sensations, the illusion of control that so easily turns clarity into resistance. You have been taught to believe that control equals safety. From an early age, you were praised for order, keeping plans, setting goals, mastering the unpredictable. You learned to equate clarity with power and uncertainty with failure. But at some point, life begins to dismantle that structure, and what was once a strategy for stability becomes a barrier to evolution. The more you tighten your grip, the more life slips through your fingers, not because you are failing, but because consciousness no longer fits inside the architecture of control. The mind in its brilliance seeks patterns. It survives by predicting outcomes and minimizing risk. Yet what we call control is often just the nervous system trying to protect itself from feeling. Every attempt to explain, label, or plan our way out of discomfort is a subtle act of defense against transformation. When consciousness starts moving, the mind interprets it as disorder. But what looks like chaos to the rational brain is often the geometry of a larger intelligence, rearranging your reality from the inside out. Control is seductive because it gives the illusion of certainty. You think, if I can just understand it, I can fix it. If I can fix it, I can prevent pain. But consciousness doesn't work like that. It doesn't speak the language of certainty. It moves through symbols, timing, sensations, through events that logic cannot anticipate. Trying to rationalize these processes is like trying to chart the wind. You can describe its direction, but you can't dictate its path. There is a moment in every transformation when the structures that once made sense begin to fail. The plans you made stop aligning. The explanations that once felt solid start to dissolve. This dissolution is terrifying because it threatens identity, the I that thinks it knows how life should unfold. You resist, tighten, double down on routine, and yet things keep falling apart. It feels like betrayal. But what if it's liberation? What if the breakdown of control is the precise condition required for your consciousness to operate freely again? From a quantum perspective, control belongs to the realm of observation, the point where potential collapses into a single interpretation. But consciousness is not the observer. It is the field itself, the infinite spectrum of probabilities. When you insist on controlling outcomes, you narrow the field to what your mind can handle. You stop seeing possibilities that lie beyond logic's comfort zone. Life becomes a loop of repetition, not because destiny is cruel, but because you keep projecting the same limited observation over the vastness of potential. You can witness this in simple, human ways. You plan every detail of your day, and one unexpected phone call rearranges it completely. You build your identity around being the reliable one, and suddenly the world demands that you let go. You try to explain away the strange coincidences that follow you, the repeated numbers, the recurring dreams, the sudden memories. The mind calls them random. Consciousness calls them coordinates. They are not there to be controlled. They are there to be read. In truth, control is an act of mistrust. It assumes that life cannot move without your supervision. Yet life has been breathing you since before you learned the concept of I. Your heartbeat, your cellular renewal, your inspiration, they all happen beyond your command. The same intelligence that governs those processes also guides the unfolding of your experience. To believe you must control it is to forget that you are made of it. This is where the illusion becomes transparent. The more you surrender, not as defeat, but as cooperation, the more the system recalibrates. The paradox is that real stability arises only when you stop demanding it. What the rational mind fears as loss of control is actually the restoration of coherence. Consciousness does not want you to abandon direction. It wants you to remember that direction emerges from alignment, not from willpower. A subtle experiment can reveal this truth. The next time something deviates from your plan, a delay, an interruption, a misunderstanding, notice the body's immediate response. The tightening of the chest, the shallow breath, the inner command to fix. Then, instead of reacting, pause. Let the sensation move without interpretation. In that space, watch what unfolds. Often a solution arises that logic could never have conceived. That moment is the proof. When you stop trying to control, intelligence reveals itself through spontaneity. The irony is that control is not the opposite of chaos. It is its partner. Each time you tighten, the universe has to expand in proportion, creating tension until balance is restored. What you experience as life falling apart is simply the system reasserting wholeness. Control fractures, consciousness integrates. When you begin to see through this illusion, you start moving differently. You plan, but you hold the plan loosely. You decide, but you allow the unknown to breathe between your choices. You begin to sense that what guides you isn't your mind's precision, but your presence's receptivity. And it's in that receptive state that a new rhythm begins, one that feels less like command and more like conversation. Because when control dissolves, truth begins to approach. It doesn't crash through the door, it enters quietly through the same cracks the mind tried to seal. At first it unsettles you, because truth doesn't confirm your identity, it questions it. But that is the next phase of the journey, when you start noticing that life itself is reflecting something back to you, repeating certain patterns, guiding you toward a mirror that doesn't flatter, but reveals. It never arrives dramatically. Truth doesn't announce itself with thunder or spectacle. It slips in quietly, almost disguised, as a repetition you can't explain, a pattern you swear you've already lived. Something familiar begins replaying in your life, not as coincidence but as reflection. You find yourself meeting the same kind of person in a different body, facing the same conflict in a new context, speaking the same words with slightly altered tones. At first, it feels like life mocking you. In reality, it's life mirroring you. There comes a threshold where consciousness stops speaking in abstractions and begins to speak in events. This is the moment when the truth starts to materialize, not as a mystical revelation, but as an undeniable repetition. It's the universe holding up a mirror so that what you've been unwilling to see within yourself can no longer hide. The external world becomes a feedback mechanism, echoing your internal state with perfect accuracy. You start noticing how similar the new feels to the old. Different people, different settings, yet the emotional gravity is identical. That's not bad luck, that's coherence forming. Consciousness doesn't use punishment, it uses resonance. It repeats the vibration until it's recognized. Every repetition is an invitation to awareness. Do you see it now? At first, you resist. You analyze. You create stories to explain why this pattern keeps happening. You might blame timing, karma, other people, but the pattern remains, untouched by explanation. It isn't there to be solved. It's there to be seen. Because truth doesn't need justification. It only needs presence. The moment you stop trying to interpret the mirror and start feeling what it shows, something shifts. The tension inside begins to dissolve, and the pattern that once felt oppressive starts to reveal its purpose. It can be disorienting when you realize that the mirror has never been external. The people who triggered you were carriers of your own reflection. The situations that frustrated you were simply amplifiers of an inner dissonance. The truth doesn't appear as new information, it appears as recognition. You don't learn it, you remember it. It's that subtle moment when the mind pauses and something deeper whispers, "You've been here before." From a scientific perspective, this could be seen as pattern recognition in neural networks. The brain conserves energy by looping familiar pathways, even when those pathways lead to discomfort. But consciousness is not limited to biology. It uses the same mechanism to evolve. It repeats experience until the pattern of awareness expands beyond it. When you finally observe the loop without judgment, the energy that sustained it begins to dissipate. The repetition breaks not through effort, but through recognition. It's at this stage that your relationship with discomfort transforms. What once felt like attack now feels like message. You begin to notice the subtle intelligence behind every setback, the argument that pushes you to silence, the delay that disrupts your plan, the loss that empties your expectations. All are mirrors showing you where identity still clings. The mirror is merciless only when you refuse to look. Once you dare to, it becomes merciful, because it frees you from blindness. Still, the process isn't smooth. Truth often first appears as resistance. You feel a tightening inside, a recoil that says, "Not this again." That recoil is your consciousness trying to delay recognition. It's not fear of truth. It's fear of losing the version of yourself that existed before truth. The identity you've built begins to tremble, not because it's wrong, but because it's incomplete. To meet truth fully, you must be willing to let parts of you die, not physically but symbolically, the image of who you thought you were, the certainty of what you thought was real. There's a curious peace that follows the tremor. When you stop running from what keeps repeating, you stop fighting life. You begin to move differently, slower, quieter. You start noticing how reality organizes itself around the frequency of your attention. You realize that you don't attract experiences, you resonate with them. The mirror is always accurate. What changes is your ability to interpret its reflection without distortion. One simple way to work with this moment is to observe without defense. When a familiar discomfort arises, instead of asking, "Why is this happening again?" ask, "What is this showing me about myself that I haven't yet integrated?" Then listen, not with the mind, but with the entire body. The body always tells the truth first. Maybe the shoulders tighten, the breath shortens, or a specific memory flashes for no reason. That's the signal. Follow it, because the mirror doesn't lie, and it never repeats without purpose. Over time, as you learn to meet the mirror instead of fighting it, truth becomes less threatening. It begins to unfold as a living conversation between your consciousness and reality itself. The more honest your perception becomes, the more fluid life feels. You notice how patterns stop escalating, how situations that once drained you now simply pass through. The mirror keeps functioning, but now it reflects movement instead of stagnation. And then comes the next threshold, the subtle moment when you tell yourself, "I've already learned this." You think the pattern is finished, the wound healed, yet something inside still pulses, quietly reminding you that understanding is not the same as integration. This is the next layer of the process, when resistance begins to disguise itself as reason, and consciousness waits, patient and precise, for the moment you become willing to listen again. There is a kind of resistance that doesn't scream or fight. It dresses itself in logic, speaks calmly, and wears the tone of maturity. It tells you that you're past that you've already worked on it, that you understand it now. This is the resistance disguised as reason, the most sophisticated defense mechanism your consciousness has ever built. It doesn't block awareness with chaos, it blocks it with coherence. And because it sounds rational, it's harder to recognize than fear. When the mind begins to sense the proximity of truth, it creates explanations to soften the impact. It says, "This is just stress," or "It's not the right time to deal with this," or "I've already healed from that." These statements feel grounded, even wise, but beneath them lies an unspoken tension, the subtle avoidance of vulnerability. Logic becomes a refuge, a way to intellectualize emotion instead of feeling it. The mind builds walls out of words and calls them understanding. You can sense this form of resistance in the quiet spaces when something stirs in you and the first response isn't curiosity but analysis. The mind rushes to label what the body hasn't even finished expressing. You think you're being self-aware, but often you're being self-defensive. True awareness doesn't explain, it listens. Explanation is what the mind does when it doesn't want to feel. This illusion is tricky because reason itself isn't the enemy. Reason is essential. It helps navigate reality. The problem arises when reason becomes a substitute for contact. You start living in interpretations instead of sensations. You talk about healing instead of embodying it. You recall insights instead of inhabiting them. The distance grows between what you know and what you live, and that distance is precisely where resistance hides. From a psychological point of view, this is a function of cognitive dissonance, the gap between what you believe and what you experience. The mind protects you from that gap by creating plausible narratives. They feel truthful because they preserve stability. But consciousness isn't concerned with stability. It's concerned with authenticity. So it keeps surfacing the very feelings you've already resolved, not to punish you, but to integrate the layers you only understood intellectually. You might notice this when old emotions reappear unexpectedly. You've already talked about the event in therapy, written about it, forgiven everyone involved. And yet, one day, something small, a tone of voice, a scent, a phrase, brings the same ache back to life. Instantly, reason intervenes. This makes no sense, I've moved on. But consciousness isn't bound by linear time. Healing doesn't follow a calendar. What returns isn't regression, it's retrieval. A forgotten fragment of you is resurfacing, asking not to be analyzed but reclaimed. In that moment you have a choice, to explain it away or to feel it through. The first preserves the intellect's comfort, the second restores the soul's coherence. Feeling through it doesn't mean dramatizing or over-identifying. It means letting the sensation complete its cycle without interference. Most emotional patterns persist because they've never been allowed to finish. They rise, and before they can dissolve, reason interrupts and redirects the energy back into storage. That's how resistance becomes cyclical. It wears the face of wisdom while keeping you exactly where you are. This disguised resistance is also reinforced culturally. Society rewards composure, rationality, and emotional control. You're praised for being strong, for keeping it together, for moving on quickly. But often what's called strength is just suppression in elegant clothing. We've been trained to admire those who can narrate their pain without trembling, forgetting that trembling is sometimes the only honest response to truth. Here's the paradox. The more spiritually aware you become, the more subtle your resistance can be. The ego of awakening learns to quote insight to avoid intimacy. It can recite profound truths while refusing to live them. It hides behind phrases like, "I already know this," or "I'm observing without attachment," when in reality it's observing to avoid feeling. This form of resistance is invisible to the untrained eye because it wears the language of growth. But consciousness always knows the difference between understanding and embodiment. To see through this disguise, you must cultivate a new kind of honesty, one that goes beyond intellect. When you notice yourself explaining, pause. Feel what the explanation is protecting. Maybe it's grief, maybe it's uncertainty, maybe it's the rawness of realizing you don't have control after all. The moment you stop defending the feeling, it begins to move. The body softens, the breath deepens. What once seemed like regression reveals itself as expansion. There's a quiet test that life often uses here. After a deep insight, something will return to challenge it. A situation, a conversation, a familiar pattern. something that asks, do you know this truth or have you become it? This isn't repetition, it's verification. Consciousness doesn't demand belief, it demands integration. Reason will try to convince you that you're done, that there's no need to revisit old wounds. But the truth doesn't fade when ignored. It waits in silence until you're soft enough to hear it again. And it's in this waiting that the next threshold begins to form, the realization that the real mistake was never the presence of fear, but the interpretation of it. Because what you've been calling fear might not be an obstacle at all, but the precise signal that you're about to cross the line between who you've been and who you're becoming. There is a moment in every inner transformation when you start to feel something rising, an uneasiness that feels too big, too undefined to name. It begins as a vibration beneath the surface of your life, a quiet instability that makes even simple things feel uncertain. This is usually the moment when people retreat, when they mistake the trembling for danger. They believe that something has gone wrong, when in truth, something is about to be born. The most common mistake in this process is not feeling fear. It's misunderstanding what fear actually means. Fear in this context is not a warning of failure. It's an announcement of expansion. It signals that the structure of your identity is being stretched beyond its current form. But because your nervous system has been conditioned to equate safety with familiarity, the unfamiliar feels threatening. You interpret the pull of transformation as the approach of danger, and so you tighten. That tightening, the reflex to protect the known self, is what creates suffering, not the fear itself. From a biological perspective, fear is the body's intelligence preparing for change. The same chemical surge that primes you to run or defend also sharpens awareness. It heightens presence. It readies the organism for adaptation. But when the mind interprets that energy as a problem, the process freezes. Instead of using fear as fuel for perception, you turn it into evidence that something is wrong. You stop moving. You start analyzing. You seek control. And by doing so, you interrupt the very current that was meant to carry you forward. There's a certain irony here. The body knows how to evolve. It sheds, adapts, recalibrates. But the psychological self, the image you hold of who you are, clings. It resists the unknown because its existence depends on continuity. So when consciousness tries to expand, identity contracts. You rationalize the contraction. This isn't the right time. Maybe I'm not ready. It's too risky. You call the contraction prudence, but it's fear pretending to be wisdom. Fear, when allowed to speak, has precision. It's not vague. It points exactly to the edge of what you're ready to see. The trembling you feel isn't chaos, it's orientation. It's showing you where the boundary of your old self lies. Crossing it feels like death because, in a symbolic sense, it is. The patterns that defined you, your explanations, your defenses, your familiar ways of controlling outcomes, begin to dissolve. The mistake is believing that their dissolution means you're losing yourself. In reality, you're losing the version of yourself that was built around avoidance. Think of it as a frequency shift. When your consciousness starts to rise, the lower frequencies of your past experience, fear, grief, shame, begin to surface, not to sabotage you, but to synchronize with the new vibration. They can't come with you unchanged. They must be metabolized, integrated, reinterpreted. But if you treat their appearance as regression, you collapse back into the old frequency. You retreat from the very doorway you were meant to cross. You can often sense this mistake in the way you talk to yourself when things get uncomfortable. You might say, I shouldn't be feeling this anymore, or I thought I already healed that. Those thoughts reveal the hidden expectation that growth should feel calm. But transformation is not the absence of turbulence. It's the reorganization of energy. Every time you evolve, your system must destabilize before it rebalances. The turbulence is proof that the process is working. The truth is, fear and awakening are not opposites. They are partners. Fear is the friction created when consciousness outgrows its container. It's the body catching up with awareness. When you allow that friction to exist without labeling it as failure, it transforms into clarity. The energy that once felt paralyzing becomes directional. You begin to see that fear was never asking you to stop. It was asking you to pay attention. In this way, fear can become your most reliable guide. It points precisely where your next threshold lies, but it can only reveal its message when you stop trying to silence it. Most people do the opposite. They drown it with distraction or reframe it with premature positivity. They treat fear as a symptom to fix, not a compass to follow. That avoidance is what keeps them looping in the same patterns, mistaking motion for progress. Here's the paradox. Courage doesn't mean feeling fearless. Courage means being willing to walk with fear as part of the dialogue. When you treat fear as feedback, rather than interference, it becomes the most honest signal of alignment. You start noticing how, beneath the anxiety, there's a subtle current of expansion, a quiet sense that something is calling you forward. The trembling that once felt like a threat starts to feel like momentum. And it's precisely at this point, when fear shifts from obstacle to signal, that another dynamic begins to unfold. Life, now invited to participate fully in your transformation, accelerates the process. The outer world starts to rearrange itself in sync with your internal evolution. Plans collapse, relationships realign, familiar paths dissolve. It feels, once again, like everything is breaking apart. But this time it's not misunderstanding, it's movement. The breaking point is near, and what appears as chaos may be nothing more than your consciousness preparing to break free. There comes a day when the subtle tremors you've been feeling finally become impossible to ignore. What was once an inner restlessness starts to spill into your outer world. The structures that gave your life shape begin to loosen, and the rhythm that once felt predictable collapses into silence. You watch plans dissolve, relationships shift, paths disappear, and something in you recognizes that this is not coincidence. It's the moment when the universe stops whispering and starts shouting. The breaking point is not a punishment, it's a synchronization. Up until this point, consciousness has been sending quiet signals through discomfort, repetition, intuition. But the rational mind has tried to negotiate with them to maintain some illusion of control. When those negotiations fail, reality intervenes. The external world begins to mirror the internal rupture that you've been trying to contain. Life dismantles what you refuse to release. Jobs end, people leave, certainties crumble. You may feel as if everything is falling apart, but in truth, everything is falling into place, just not the place you planned. The breaking point is the precise threshold where resistance meets inevitability. It's where your old identity, stretched beyond its limit, can no longer sustain coherence. The tension that has been building between who you've been and who you are becoming finally snaps. From the outside, it looks like chaos. From the inside, it feels like collapse. But energetically, it's release. The same force that breaks the shell is the one that allows the seed to grow. In physics, there's a concept called critical mass, the moment when a system reaches a density of energy so intense that transformation becomes irreversible. Spiritually, this is what the breaking point represents. Every avoided emotion, every postponed decision, every unspoken truth accumulates like pressure beneath the surface. The breaking point is not the moment the pressure appears, it's the moment it becomes visible. The system can no longer hold its old configuration. Something must give, and that giving is the beginning of freedom. It's a paradoxical state, because it feels like both destruction and revelation at once. The ground disappears, but so do the illusions that kept you standing on false ground. You begin to see how much of your life was built around the maintenance of comfort. The roles you played, the promises you kept out of obligation, the identities you wore like armor, they all start to fracture under the weight of authenticity. The collapse is not personal, it's architectural. Consciousness is reclaiming its space. The breaking point also exposes the fragility of the stories you tell yourself. You might have believed you were in control, that your plans were guiding your life. But here in the disarray, you begin to see that control was only ever a temporary structure, a way to delay surrender. The loss of control, painful as it feels, is what allows life to reorganize itself around a more truthful pattern. Every ending reveals a design that was always hidden beneath the noise of certainty. There's an intelligence in the collapse if you're willing to look closely. Notice how, even in the midst of dismantling, certain things remain untouched. The people or practices that nourish you most deeply persist. The insights that once seemed abstract suddenly become practical. The deeper self, the one that has been observing all of this, remains steady, almost untouched by the chaos. That's the paradox of the breaking point. While everything you identify with disintegrates, the one who is aware of the disintegration is expanding. Fear may surge here with new intensity. It's natural. The nervous system interprets loss as danger. But what's really happening is liberation from a configuration that could no longer support your growth. If you resist this stage, the process prolongs itself through repetition. If you allow it, the pressure releases, and a new sense of coherence begins to form. What breaks is not you, it's the container that kept your consciousness confined. There's a moment in every genuine awakening when life feels like it's conspiring against you, when every plan backfires, every path closes, and every familiar rhythm collapses. But if you pause, even for an instant, you'll feel a strange pulse beneath the surface, a quiet intelligence moving through the wreckage, rearranging everything according to a deeper order. What looks like chaos is just consciousness reorganizing reality around a truer center. You might not see it yet, but this breakdown is a form of precision. It's how the universe clears interference from your field. Everything that can no longer resonate with your next frequency must leave. Every attachment built on illusion must dissolve. It's not cruelty, it's coherence asserting itself. The mind sees destruction, consciousness sees restoration. And just when the disorientation feels unbearable, when every external anchor has been stripped away, something subtle begins to emerge. Beneath the debris, you start to sense a familiar vibration, something you'd forgotten but somehow always known. It's not coming from the outside world, it's rising from within. Because what your consciousness is truly preparing you to face is not an external enemy, not a punishment, but the part of you that was left behind, the one now returning, asking to be seen, integrated, and finally brought home. When everything begins to crumble, your first instinct is to look outward, to search for causes, culprits, and cosmic explanations. You want to know why this is happening, who or what is responsible for the collapse that has stripped you bare. But eventually the investigation leads to silence. There's no one left to blame. The walls of circumstance fall away, and what stands before you isn't the world's cruelty, it's your own reflection. What your consciousness is trying to reveal has never been external. It's the part of you that was left behind. This is the hidden truth at the core of every breaking point. What you're truly about to face is yourself, not the version polished for survival, but the one you buried to be loved, to be accepted, to belong. Every adaptation, every persona, every performance you constructed to navigate life required that some part of you be hidden. The child who felt too intense, too sensitive, too wild. The voice that once spoke freely before it learned what silence could protect. The instinct that knew truth before reason learned to deny it. Those are the fragments now returning, demanding entry into the life you've built without them. At first, this reunion doesn't feel tender. It feels like confrontation. The repressed parts of you don't return as soft whispers. They return as emotions, patterns, and sensations that seem to erupt out of nowhere. Anger that doesn't make sense. Grief with no clear object. A restlessness that defies explanation. You might think you're regressing, but in truth you're being reintroduced to what you once exiled. These emotions are not intruders. They're messengers carrying memories that never had closure. Psychologically, this is the moment when the subconscious becomes visible. What was suppressed to maintain your sense of order begins to move toward integration. You can feel it physically, like heat in the chest, tightness in the throat, trembling in the hands. The body becomes the stage where the forgotten parts of you reappear, each carrying an imprint of the moment they were dismissed. This isn't pathology, it's reconciliation. Consciousness uses the language of sensation to guide you toward the places you stopped listening. To meet yourself fully is to face the paradox of your own becoming. The version of you that mastered control, logic, and resilience was never false, it was necessary. It built the bridge that got you here. But now that structure can no longer contain the totality of your being. The self that once protected you is now the one preventing your expansion. Facing yourself means honoring what that version achieved while also allowing it to dissolve. It's a burial and a birth happening simultaneously. This confrontation also reveals something you might not expect: compassion. Once you see the mechanisms that shaped your defenses, you can't help but soften. You realize that every avoidance, every act of denial, every attempt at control was born out of love, a distorted, frightened kind of love, but love nonetheless. The part of you that pushed others away was trying to prevent pain. The part that sought perfection was trying to earn belonging. Even your numbness was an act of protection. Awareness turns judgment into tenderness. Still, this compassion doesn't make the process easier. There's grief in meeting the self you abandoned. Grief for the time lost pretending to be someone else. Grief for the authenticity you traded for approval. This grief is sacred. It's the cleansing river between your past and your becoming. When you allow it to move through you, it doesn't drown. It purifies. It washes away the residue of resistance, leaving behind a quiet recognition. You were never broken, only divided. You might start noticing strange alignments during this phase. People re-emerge from your past. Situations arise that mirror old wounds with uncanny precision. It can feel like déjà vu, but what's really happening is integration through repetition. Life brings back the echoes, so you can meet them from a new frequency. The difference now is that you're not trying to fix them, you're witnessing them. That witnessing, without defense or story, is the act of wholeness returning to itself. This stage of the journey isn't about healing in the conventional sense, it's about remembering. Healing implies repair. Remembering means restoration. Remembering, bringing the dismembered parts of yourself back into unity. When you stop treating your pain as an enemy and begin to see it as an ally of awareness, it transforms from a wound into a doorway. The same energy that once fragmented you becomes the force that reassembles you, and when that reassembly begins, reality itself starts to shift. The people you attract, the decisions you make, the rhythm of your days, all begin to align with a different coherence. You start acting from a place that no longer needs validation because it no longer hides. The world doesn't necessarily become easier, but it becomes clearer. The noise quiets, you move with less explanation, more precision. The truth that once terrified you now moves through you as calm. This is what you were preparing for all along. Not enlightenment, not perfection, but authenticity. To face what you've hidden is to reclaim your own frequency. It's the moment consciousness stops preparing and starts embodying. And as this reclamation unfolds, something subtle begins to stir. A realization that the revelation isn't complete yet. Because as soon as you meet what you once rejected, life will hand you a choice: to run and repeat the cycle, or to stay and evolve. The moment of choice is approaching, quiet but inevitable, waiting for you to see that awakening has never been about becoming someone new. It's about finally standing without disguise in who you already are. When consciousness begins to reveal what you weren't ready to see, life offers a sacred crossroad. You can run and repeat or stay and rise. The pain you've been fearing was never the enemy, it was the invitation. Every collapse, every silence, every pulse of uncertainty has been preparing you to hold more truth, more presence, more of yourself. You are not breaking down, you are unfolding. This is the threshold where awakening stops being theory and becomes embodiment, where you stop seeking light and start becoming it. If you made it here, write in the comments, "I'm ready to face myself." That's how I'll know you've walked this journey all the way to the end. And if this message spoke to you, choose one of the videos appearing on your screen. Keep following this path of awareness and let consciousness continue the conversation with you.